Lesson 4: Structures in Systems. In this lesson, we will understand how we can use the concept of archetypes in trying to decipher systems. There are 9 system archetypes that we will go over, and these archetypes have been discussed by different authors, particularly by Peter Senge as well. In our previous lesson, we learned how to identify and build causal loop diagrams. We also identified the basic feedback loops that exist in these causal loop diagrams. Unfortunately, when we begin to look at systems, systems are oftentimes complex and ambiguous, and therefore building your causal loop diagrams can become very difficult. This is where it helps us to understand these systems by relying on what we call archetypes. What is an archetype? Typically, when you try to understand systems, systems tend to have some sort of general form. Archetypes are those common and usually recurring patterns of behaviors in organizations, regardless of their affinity, their nature, or type of industry. These patterns almost always result in some negative consequences or unintended effects. Archetypes have been studied quite early since the 1960s by Jay Forrester, Dennis Meadows, Donella Meadows, who are the pioneers in the field called system dynamics. Systems thinking is actually an offshoot or a more management perspective of what we call system dynamics then. There are common system archetypes that we would like to go to, and each of these archetypes have their own unique storyline. And the goal for us is to understand what's the storyline in your system so that we can understand it better and how we can address the underlying structure and behavior of your organization. In our previous lessons, we talked about constructing the feedback loop of our systems and putting them together in what we call a causal loop diagram. Normally, when we look at systems, they're never as easy or as simple to understand with, even with the causal loop diagram. And things can become more complicated and overwhelming when we begin to dig deeper into the structure of your system. Archetypes are a quick way for us to better understand the dynamics of a set of behaviors that have manifested in other systems that often result to some unwanted condition or effects. We use the archetypes as a guideline for determining what is really happening, and once identified, we get a quick way to introduce an intervention to your system. Archetypes are also a way to communicate to other members of the organization how systems react and how they actually behave depending on its nature. For each of these archetypes, there are corresponding strategies that you can actually test using different perspectives of the archetypes that would allow you to evaluate your strategies even before you implement them. And finally, by understanding the archetypes, you can leverage this knowledge on how you might build a better system so that your system becomes immune to these side effects. In this lesson, we will cover 9 basic system archetypes. Most of these archetypes are extensively discussed by Peter Senge in his book. In his book on the 5th discipline, Peter Senge covers these archetypes. He talked about the limits to growth, shifting the burden, eroding goals, escalation, success to the successful, the strategy of the commons, which is quite extensive covered by other authors as well, fixes that fail, growth and underinvestment, and lastly, balancing with delay. One of the most popular system archetypes is called limits to growth. A limits to growth archetype talks about a system that has the potential or the ability to demonstrate quick and fast growth, and that this growth suddenly or to some extent slows down eventually over time. This kind of pattern exists in many organizations where they keep on driving and driving something until it slowly plateaus. The typical patterns of behavior for limits to growth would often have a very fast growth followed by a slowing down, and then eventually leading to no more escalation or no more acceleration of the growth. The management principle here is not to be able to just push for the growth, but understand that there is a limiting condition that weakens the growth itself. Some people sometimes associate this to a diminishing return over time. So instead of trying to find ways to drive growth further, look for that limiting condition. Examples of this would be a growth of a city, which eventually stabilizes or declines. Your learning process. When you try to learn something, you can only absorb as much and eventually it seems like nothing goes into your head anymore. A growth of a young company experiencing spurts like startups and then eventually plateaus, or a new product that you would launch, okay? And then eventually it becomes like a typical basic product that's out there in the market at the moment. Another system archetype is called shifting the burden. In this system archetype, we normally try to address a problem or the symptom of the problem using what we call a short-term or a band-aid solution. Because the short-term or band-aid solution often has immediate effect, the decision maker oftentimes would not necessarily have the same desire to pursue the fundamental solution or the long-term solution. Eventually, the short-term solution is more preferred than the long-term or fundamental solution, such that the attention is more on trying to address the symptom than actually understanding the main cause or the root cause of the problem. And therefore, what is actually being done is that because the symptomatic solution is being addressed, the side effect of that is that the need to address the problem using a fundamental solution takes more time or is being delayed. A typical pattern of behavior would be something where you rely so much on the solution because it is effective, and therefore there's no urgency to actually pursue the fundamental solution. The key management principle here is to focus on real long-term solutions rather than use band-aid solutions. We will use the band-aid solutions or symptomatic solutions to gain time, but not at the expense of pursuing the fundamental solution. Typical examples of shifting the burden are often associated to levels of addiction, like credit cards. Because you're able to buy what you want, you keep on using the credit card instead of actually pursuing a more fundamental solution of watching your budget. Alcohol and drugs or addiction in any form is often a good example of shifting the burden. Instead of dealing with the problem, people look for some way to relieve their symptoms or their pains. Over time is also another shifting the burden instead of actually focusing more on how to improve the process. And even inspection or any quality assurance can often be a shifting the burden, where the real problem is not at the final end, but at the source of the product manufacturing or the product itself. A third system archetype is called eroding goals. Have you ever dreamed of something that you want to become and eventually decided to settle? Eroding goals are a classic example wherein organizations or systems have a very aspiring goal, and that upon executing realizes that the actual performance doesn't meet up to what the goal is. In order to be able to console itself or be able to manage its ability to achieve the goal, the system decides to lower its goal or relax its targets. The effect of this idea is that by lowering the goal, the decision to adjust to a lowering of goal leads to the decline in the system's performance. Patterns of behavior for this type of a structure or archetype are often associated to when we relax our targets or when we lower our standards. The main principle here is for us to hold on the vision, find means to adapt, to change, to make it work. Examples of eroding goals are when we lower our quality standards by cutting budget, when we lower our targets in the government for the sake of balancing deficit, or even allowing endangered species to die just to push for industrialization. The fourth archetype is called escalation. Escalation oftentimes manifests itself when there are competing systems or units in a system, where these units or parties tend to take mutually different actions that can threaten the other side. And because there is a threatening result of the actions, the effect of the actions of the two parties escalates the other person or the other unit's attempt to do something to one up or to be able to do one over the other. Typical patterns of behavior here would be when two systems collide because the interest of one is dependent on the having an advantage over the other. And because that advantage is something that each system or each player tries to get one on top of the other, the resulting effect is a never-ending escalation or changes that might happen. And therefore, because of that, the never-ending war continues. The management principle here is to look for a win-win situation or pursue peaceful actions, wherein you try to find ways by which both sides can benefit, rather than making it a zero-sum game or a 0-1 game. Examples of this are arms race, when you talk about the Cold War, for those who remember that. Marriage problem, when both, the husband, the wife feels that he should not be the one to come to the husband, or she should get more, or she should be happier, or the husband wants to also have the same thought that he should have the priority. And because of that, you get an escalation of the two parties' view on the entire system. Transport fares, when you increase the price of transportation, public transportation, then of course manufacturing costs would also be affected, and then salaries would be affected, and then when salaries are affected, then you would say, oh, transportation eventually will have to go up again. Okay? The conflict in Mindanao also can be considered as an escalation when the military attacks the Muslim the unit, and then the other part attacks the other unit, and eventually it escalates. Escalation happens also within the organization when competing departments or divisions vie over one getting a better result than the other. Our fifth archetype is called the success to the successful. A success to the successful happens when the better person often gets better, or some people would say the rich gets richer, the poor gets poorer. This is where two systems oftentimes compete for a resource which is finite, meaning limited, and that because the one that gets more tends to be able to do better than the one who has less, then technically what happens is the successful one becomes more successful, because the person or the unit that gets more of that allows him or her to do more than the one that doesn't have that much access. Patterns of behavior here would be oftentimes when two units compete for a limited resource, where the successful one usually starves the other. The management principle here is to find a way to decouple, to break the dependence of the two units so that the success of one doesn't mean to the detriment of the other. We need to have a balanced way to look at the achievements of both systems rather than one over the other. Examples here would be like work and family life balance. When they say that if you're successful in your work, it requires you to sacrifice your family. Or if you want to spend time with the family, then you can't give as much time to the work. Or a slow learner and a fast learner in any learning environment, where the teacher tends to put more attention to the fast learner than the slow learner. Or two products in an organization with limited funds or resources. Or maybe in your own logistics, where you tend to put more products that are of higher margin than the other, thereby starving the other product. The next archetype is called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a very popular concept where when different entities or units or parties are competing for a common resource such that they don't eventually pay attention to that resource being depleted, which eventually will be a negative result to all of them. So eventually nobody wins. This example of a tragedy of commons happens a lot when we take advantage of the environment, where eventually if we use it up, eventually nobody has something left. And the idea is that when the resource is eventually gone or eventually exhausted, then the entire system shuts down and everybody loses. A typical pattern of behavior here is when you have an available resource for everyone, but eventually it becomes scarce for everyone. The management principle here is to educate everyone and create what we call a self-regulating system where everyone should cooperate and preserve that resource so they can continue to grow. Examples here would be when they have, say, an organization that has a shared secretariat pool, and eventually the secretariat becomes too tired because everybody wants their own time, or maybe a customer service, a pooled customer service, and that every unit or every, say, brand wants to have their own time and be served, or competing for a beverage in a beverage business with single market. When you have multiple players in the same location, eventually they kill each other because of over competition. In this fixes that fail archetype, what often happens is that you're able to pursue the right solution and address the right problem, but eventually there is this unintended consequence that you did not think about, and that what happens is that the problem eventually become worse. Common examples here would be situations where a certain department tries to fix the problem, but eventually it becomes a problem to the other department. So fixes that fail are typically those that create unintended consequences or non-systems view of the problem, thereby only eliminating the symptom, what's in front of them, but not what's ailing the entire organization. Patterns of behavior here oftentimes are those when you see an improvement in your solution, but eventually it stops working. The management principle is to focus on long-term solutions instead of just short-term, but focus on solutions that address the entire system and not just a piece of it or a portion of it. Some examples of this might be familiar with the other archetypes, that's shifting the burden, but in this case, fixes that fail are the correct solutions for a localized or non-holistic view. But there is a side effect that wasn't intended, and that's where fixes eventually fail. Credit card use can be a good tool, but eventually that can lead to a problem if you're not able to manage your credit card well. Cutting back on maintenance can be something, but eventually that will lead to more problems in maintenance. Or any cost-cutting project or programs that you may have could become or could result to unintended consequences. The second to the last archetype is called growth and underinvestment. In this archetype, what we normally experience is that the growth that we are experiencing, or a growing pattern of improvement, for example, is reaching its limited value. Potentially it's about to not continue to grow, and that the decision is to be able to drive more resources so that it will continue to grow. It's like when you have a child, and that by exposing the child to more challenges, the child can grow. But by contending to saying that, oh, you have enough, that means you're in a way stunting the growth of your child. Similarly, that's what's happening to a system when the needed resources for it to grow is no longer made available or is being limited, thereby leading to a decline in the performance of your system. Typical patterns here would be the growth approaches a limit by a limiting constraint, and that because of this limiting constraint, the sufficiency and aggressiveness of adding resources is being held back, which is oftentimes going to be something that will start the underdevelopment of the system. The management principle here is that potential growth should be built and the capacity should be developed in order to create the demand, rather than simply being contented with the demand. Hold the vision of your goal and put the resources that needed in order to drive the system's behavior or performance. Examples here would be decline in the service or product quality, because we tend to blame the competitor, where in fact it should be something we need to do more to explore more markets. Sales decline, again blaming the competitor that the sales it's declining because the competition is tighter, is similar, where instead to put more effort or do something to the sales to be able to grow more. Having a grand plan but not realistically assessing the needed time and effort to achieve the vision oftentimes is the major reason why there is growth and eventual decline because of underinvestment. The last archetype is called balancing process with delay. In this archetype, it demonstrates a very fundamental and basic way of looking at how we often pursue actions, and that because we are impatient on the results of our actions, we tend to do a corrective action immediately without even thinking whether the current action is appropriate or not. Because there is an inherent delay of our action, we try to overact or overreact even before the actual results happen. This kind of thinking oftentimes lead us to act on something instead of to patiently observe what the real effect of things are. It's about giving time for the system to be able to reveal what the true change or improvement should be. A typical pattern of behavior here would be the system seems to be on track, but we overshoot our mark because we overdid something. The management principle is to look into the aggressiveness of the decisions you made and how aggressiveness can lead to more instability. Patience is important to make the system more responsive to the changes. Simple examples here would be when you open your shower and you open the hot and cold, and if you're not patient enough, you get burned because you try to put more hot water than the cold water. Or cycles in manufacturing where we try to preempt or try to do something ahead of the cycles in manufacturing, where you get up and down issues in your plant. Could be an issue based on maintenance or failure of the equipment. Or commodity cycles in stock markets where we try to do more ahead without thinking about it or anticipating something that's not going to happen. Key ideas I want you to have as a takeaway in this lesson. System archetypes are structures that demonstrate the common recurring patterns of behavior in your organization. These system archetypes help us identify the system architectures or structures and how they may be best intervened in order to influence the behavior of the system and achieve better results. System archetypes also help identify unintended effects of the structure and how we may address them when we design our systems later on.